We have to be careful what we say now. We're being recorded.
So how has the conference been going?
Oh, just fantastic.
That's good to hear.
Yes. How was your trip?
Oh, it's tomorrow.
Oh, okay.
So yeah, it won't be until tomorrow. So today is when we're getting ready. Yeah, this will be sort of the first trip I'm taking since the beginning of the pandemic. So it'll be interesting. I mean, like airplane trip. I mean, we have done sort of car trips out into the desert, but I haven't really been in an airport or an airplane since February of 2020. So it'll be an interesting experience.
Yeah. I hope everything goes well.
Me too. I mean, it's where we have a direct flight to San Jose, Costa Rica, and then we're spending just 2 weeks sort of on real vacation, like bird watching and such. So I'm hoping it's going to be okay, but yeah, there's been a lot of canceled flights and flight delays and stuff. So we'll see. It's apparently been particularly bad in Europe. So yeah. I'm hoping that this is going to go okay, but my partner and I are mentally prepared for hiccups because you just don't know. You just don't know what's going to happen. So yeah, so you must be thrilled that this organization and this conference is finally happening.
Yes. So I have planned nothing of this conference. It was all Kelly and Chloe who put it all together. And
wonderful. Yeah.
And
you were involved in the founding of the organization, right? Yeah.
That's right. That's right. Yeah.
So how many people are at the conference, either virtually or up in Toronto?
I'm not sure, but I'm sure Kelly can tell us. I think she's right here on Zoom.
We're around 15 to 20, I'd say.
Okay.
Give or take.
We intentionally tried to keep it small because of
COVID.
Yeah. So it was actually like invite only.
Yeah. That makes sense I mean, you still, yeah. No, it makes this year, it still really makes sense to be very careful. I mean, that's, we had a big surge here of the B5 variant. People don't seem to be getting super sick, but you also never know whether there's going to be another variant coming down the pike, right? I mean, this virus has really sort of been unpredictable in a lot of ways.
Let me just say before you start, I love the glasses. I haven't seen them before. They're absolutely
yeah, I do need reading glasses at this point. These are just the Easy Peasy IZI. They're very comfortable. They have these sort of flexible things, and since I don't wear glasses all the time, I like them to be sort of light on my ears. But yeah, for reading anything now, it's that your lens is just no longer as flexible as you get older, and so I still can see at a distance just fine, but anything that's small print up close, nothing, there's nothing you can do. So I've been getting these. They're sort of they're just big and comfortable.
I think
Thank you. I'd prefer to be able to do without them. I always get panicked when I'm somewhere and I need to read something in small print on a package or something, and I don't know whether I have reading glasses on me or not. So I always try to have like 6 pairs at the same time that I distributed over various purses and offices. So I always have a backup, because that's the worst, when you just can't read even normal print. It's just kind of blurry. Or you need to hold it like super far away, then it still becomes clear. Wow, I love this. I love Tracy's screen image there. That is fantastic.
Oh, Kelly just told us that we're ready. Are you ready?
I'm ready. Yeah,
All right.
happy to go.
Thanks, Ursula.
Hello, everyone. Good morning. It is the joy and hope of every graduate student to one day to be able to introduce their dissertation advisor at a conference. That is what I get to do here today. Ursula Heise is the chair of the Department of English at UCLA and a former professor of English at Stanford University. She holds the Marcia H. Howard Chair in Literary Studies and is the interim director of the Lab for Environmental Narrative Strategies at UCLA. She's a Guggenheim Fellow and the former president of the Association for the Study for Literature and the Environment, ASLE. Her lengthy publication list, I can't go through all of them here, includes Sense of Place and Sense of Planet, the Environmental Imagination of the Global, published by Oxford University Press, and Imagining Extinction, the Cultural Meaning of Endangered Species, published by the University of Chicago. I would like to end this introduction with a short personal note. Ursula was actually my third dissertation advisor after the first two told me that I needed to stop researching animals so that I could research serious topics. Ursula said at our very first meeting, "Oh, animals are important." She proceeded to push for the creation of critical animal studies. She brought Carol Adams, Carrie Wolf, Matthew Calarco, Randy Malamud, and many others of these first animal scholars to give talks and presentations. And as the president of ASLE, created the first meeting of ASLE, an environmental organization that focused specifically on animals. In short, part of the reason that the field of critical animal studies exists today at all is directly related to this early belief and vision of Ursula. It is very fitting that she should provide this keynote of the first meeting of the North American Association for Critical Animal Studies. Please join me in welcoming Professor Ursula K. Heise.
Thank you so much, Voss. That's a very, very generous introduction that I think way overstates my contribution to this super important field. I wanted to thank you and extend congratulations to you, to Chloe, and to Kelly for founding this organization, which is fantastic, and also extend congratulations on this first conference. I'm really delighted and excited to be part of this, especially, of course, because of the theme, the extinction and biodiversity crisis, which I think is the most important one, along with climate change currently confronting us, and possibly of longer impact than even climate change for our futures. So I come to critical animal studies from its intersection with the environmental humanities, and many of the people that Voss mentioned that I invited to Stanford at the time were people who were working sort of at that intersection, or whose work was relevant for that intersection. And I've been particularly interested for over 10 years now in the role that narratives and images play in shaping ideas, media coverage, and policies about extinction, endangered species conservation, and biodiversity and bioabundance more generally. Let me share my screen and make sure that I share sound for some video clips later on. Can you all see this? Great. So it was in writing the book that Voss mentioned about the cultural meanings of endangered species that I first started to develop the idea of multi-species justice. And so I'd like to start to talk today by talking about that concept, what it means, how it might work, and also where I've hit some roadblocks in my thinking about this, and where I would love to hear your thoughts. Multi-species justice issues, of course, arise in a lot of different social settings and ecological contexts. And so in the second part of my presentation, I'll become a little more concrete. The first part is pretty theoretical, and I'll become a little more concrete and zero in on the particular problems that arise in thinking about cities as multi-species habitats. So what happens when we think about cities? which are environments built supposedly by and for humans, as habitat for non-human species. In the third section, I'll flesh that out in more detail by presenting some of the major narrative patterns that I've discovered in stories about animals and cities. And I'd like to focus on one type of story that's interested me in particular, stories where the city is seen from the animal's perspective and humans recede into the background in a quite intentional reversal of our usual ideas about what urban nature is. And once you then take your stories as your launch pad, I'll suggest in the last part, the role that cities might play in slowing down extinction could be re-envisioned. And I'll give 2 examples from Los Angeles, my current hometown. So let me start with multi-species justice. So it is a concept that is based on the idea of environmental justice. And that, as many of you may know, is a concept that originated in the US in the 1980s, especially with a report of the United Church of Christ on toxic wastes and race in the United States. So a report on unequal distribution of exposure to toxic emissions and waste. The Reverend Benjamin Davis coined the term environmental justice in 1987. The sociologist Robert Bullard had worked on these issues starting in the late 1970s, and then in 1990 published Dumping in Dixie, Race, Class, and Environmental Quality. That was a study that showed how toxic waste sites in particular tend to be located far more often closely to communities of color than white communities in the United States. And Bullard is very insistent in his book that this is not an issue of class but one of race. So hazardous waste sites are situated in Texas, for example, near middle class, not poor African American communities. Now, that isn't true everywhere in the U.S. There are hazardous sightings that are near poor white communities. But his work demonstrated clearly that exposure to environmental risks and access to environmental benefits like access to green space, clean air, clean water, and interaction with other species is unevenly distributed. And that gave rise to the search for environmental justice in the US. Bullard also made the case more broadly that these kinds of industrial and urban environmental problems had not been given sufficient attention, and that in general, the environmental movement as it had emerged in the 60s and 70s had attracted mostly white and mostly middle and upper class followers. He suggested that linking environmentalist thought with civil rights activism would broaden the base. And that did in fact occur, in part due to his activism from circa 1990 onward. So, major environmental organizations diversified their leadership, their membership, and the issues they engaged with, which now routinely includes a strong urban focus along with activism in rural and wild areas. Environmentalism now just includes a lot more attention to questions of social difference. Environmental justice has also become part of the official mission of government institutions like the EPA. So in a shorthand, you could say that environmental justice refers to that convergence over the last 30, 35 years between struggles for social justice and for environmental conservation. Now, that formation of environmental justice is pretty specific to the United States. In most other parts of the world, environmental conservation and restoration were never issues separate from other social issues. And they weren't necessarily linked only to a question of race over other kinds of inequality. If you think of environmental movements in Latin America, for example, they've always been linked with struggles for indigenous land rights or for women's rights, or with struggles of campesinos, farmers, or those of urban slum residents and so forth. So in other words, in Latin America, it's actually really hard to find environmental organizations that focus exclusively on nature understood as separate from humans. And in many cases, race was one dimension, but among others of struggles to overcome inequality of various kinds. The Indian sociologist Ramachandra Guha and the Spanish political scientist Joan Martinez Alier had studied these kinds of movements in the global South for more than a decade when they published their book Varieties of Environmentalism in 1997. So that book proposed the concept of environmentalism of the poor to highlight the political activism of, say, protest movements against dam building in India or against deforestation in Latin America. Because these movements address both social and conservation issues, they argued they had often not been recognized as environmentalist in the North American sense, but in fact, that is what they are. That was the argument of the book. Now, today, some scholars still distinguish environmental justice from the environmentalism of the poor. Others, and I would include myself there, consider them both different varieties of environmental justice. I just wanted to briefly highlight a third variant of this kind of thought, which has come under the label of political ecology since the 90s. Now, that strand comes less directly out of political action, and many of you may be familiar with it, more out of political theory, mostly of a Marxian flavor. A basic idea here is that particular kinds of social organization and particular kinds of nature are co-produced by the same capitalist processes, and that changing those processes will then change both societies and ecologies. If you wanted to put it a bit simply, as a colleague of mine, Eric Shepard here in geography did, you could say that political ecology is centrally focused on the causes of environmental inequity, while environmental justice and environmentalism of the poor are more focused on consequences and possible remedies. I think that's broadly speaking true. Of course, in practice, the boundaries are not firm, depending on which researcher, organization, or activist you look at. I'd like to continue for the rest of my talk here to speak of environmental justice as sort of the umbrella term for these different variants of thinking about the conflicts and the convergences between fights for social justice and ecological conservation. Now, environmental justice theory has changed a lot since the late 1980s and early 1990s. At that moment, a great deal of environmental justice thinking was, implicitly or explicitly based on John Rawls's 1971 theory of justice. So it was focused on what we call distributive justice, unequal distribution of environmental risks and benefits. But that really changed in the early 2000s with the work of David Schlossberg, David Pello, and others, who argued that the exclusive focus on distributive justice really kind of lagged behind the way in which justice had been rethought in other areas of political and legal theory. And Schlossberg, in particular, proposed in his 2007 book, Defining Environmental Justice, that while distributive justice is, of course, clearly very important, it's in and of itself insufficient as a paradigm for environmental justice. So he says in the book, environmental justice movements are certainly concerned with the inequitable distribution of environmental goods and bads and the inequitable application of environmental regulations. But they're just as concerned with the lack of recognition given to individuals and communities affected by environmental ills, the functioning of communities and cultures, and with the increased political participation of such disenfranchised groups and communities in the environmental decision-making process. So that's sort of his emphasis. So in his approach, environmental justice really should include 4 dimensions: distributive, participatory, capabilities, and recognition justice. So just, I've put some explanations here on the slide, for the recording and for your help, but just very briefly, what he means here is that part of justice has to be who participates in the decision-making processes about the natural world, including other species, and about the risks and benefits, and who has the power not just to be consulted, but actually to veto, to say no to specific changes. Capabilities justice seeks to move beyond thinking about rights into thinking about whether the conditions exist for those rights to be realized. So to give you just one example, the Indian Constitution includes rights to housing and food, which is really important, but doesn't, of course, mean that every Indian actually has access to housing and sufficient food. That would be the capability, broadly speaking, the capability to flourish for both human and non-human species. And recognition justice finally refers to the recognition of knowledge systems beyond Western science as ways of understanding nature. For example, indigenous cosmologies and epistemologies that have a different approach to what can and can't be done with places or animal or plant species. So Schlossberg has 2 goals in amplifying environmental justice thinking in this way. So he wants to bring environmental justice up to date and in sync with other theories of justice. But he also adds them explicitly to find common ground between what he calls environmental justice and ecological justice. And by ecological justice, he means justice that thinks beyond humans to other species and to the rights of nature itself. So in other words, he wants to bring together the strands of environmentalism that by the early 21st century were mostly focused on human health and well-being, and those that were mostly focused on the non-human world. Now, in purely Rawlsian terms, he argues that's not easy to do. For Rawls, members of a community of justice can only be those who are full moral agents, who can reason about and participate in debates and decisions about justice. But as anyone acquainted with Peter Singer's work knows, and I'm assuming everybody at this conference knows his work really well, not all humans are full moral agents in that sense. You have children, you have the elderly, you have mentally differently abled persons that can't simply be discarded on the grounds that they are not full moral agents in that Rawlsian sense. And by the same token, the natural world, Schlossberg argues, can't be excluded from claims to moral consideration because it's not an agent in that sense. Engaging with the question of recognition, Schlossberg argues that acknowledging what humans share with other elements of the ecological world helps to expand the community of justice to other living beings. And he's very, very emphatic about not making this about similarity to humanness as a precondition, but rather by focusing on what makes humans natural. So those similarities include not just sentience, needs, interests, certain forms of agencies in individual non-human creatures, but also autonomous integrity as a feature that belongs to both non-human organisms and ecological systems. What are called status injuries that degrade the status of a human community through lack of recognition, he points out, also occur in humans' interactions with the natural world, as its functioning is disrespected or impaired because humans want to dominate it, because they neglect the impact of human actions, or they leave nature out of political and economic planning and calculations. Recognition is closely related to participation, and expanding participation beyond humans. Theories of ecological justice, Schlossberg and others, don't mean that nature itself would be called on to take part in decision-making processes, though, of course, Bruno Latour's Parliament of Things offers at least a metaphorical model that might help in envisioning what that kind of participation looks like. Hold on, I just dropped my manuscript here. But they do mean that parts, that nature or parts of the natural world might have moral or legal entitlements that must be considered through human representatives in political or legal proceedings. So laws regarding the proper treatment of animals or habitats that form part of environmental legislation in a lot of countries, for example, or the attribution of legal rights to nature itself, as in the recent constitutions of Ecuador and Bolivia. The emphasis on capabilities, the possibilities of flourishing or living a full life, also moves beyond ecological justice, moves ecological justice beyond individual organisms to the habitats and systems that are necessary for their survival. Capabilities include what is necessary for functioning and flourishing of human and non-human alike. Schlossberg says it's an integral aspect of the living process. So a comprehensive theory of justice that includes capabilities can't limit itself to humans alone. Now, it's not an easy task to draw up a list of what capabilities are necessary for human functioning. So, a basic inventory might include life, health, free movement, social bonds, and emotional ties, for example. And it's obviously even more complex to create similar inventories for animals, plants, or even systems like rivers or forests. And Schlossberg concedes that. But that's where reasoning about justice must draw on ecological science and other forms of knowledge of nature to translate the broad demands of capabilities justice into action. Now, that term that Schlossberg uses, ecological justice, hasn't found widespread use, perhaps because environmental and ecological are synonyms in a lot of contexts and for a lot of users. I'm not quite sure why it hasn't really caught on. So I've preferred the somewhat narrower term multi-species justice as a way of thinking social justice and conservation together. Donna Haraway uses the phrase multi-species environmental justice in her book, Staying with the Trouble, which came out the same year as Imagining Extinction. She doesn't really explain that choice in terms of environmental justice theories in any detail, but I think both of us were interested in, first of all, thinking about justice in terms of other living species, animals in particular, but also plants, rather than in terms of inanimate components of nature like mountains or lakes, which raise a whole set of additional issues that are now being addressed in some of these new constitutions and laws. Now, using a term like multi-species justice is, of course, just a first step. It's a way of posing the problem rather than a way of providing a solution. How do we include non-humans into the community of justice? Broadly speaking, I think there's two sets of problems that multi-species justice thinking raises. So one is about the choices and decisions that are made about particular human communities in relation to non-human species. So one really salient example of this is the conflicts that came up repeatedly between the 1960s and the 90s with the creation of wildlife refuges and national parks in the global South, often, though not always, at the initiative of conservation organizations in the global North. Initially, these conservation initiatives were often started without consulting local communities, and sometimes against their protest or resistance. So, you know, when the creation of a national park prevents local communities from hunting and logging in ways that they have practiced for centuries, it creates these conflicts. And some of you might know the 2005 novel, The Hungry Tide, by the Bengali novelist Amitav Ghosh, where he fictionalizes one such real-life scenario, the expulsion of thousands of refugees from an island in the Sundarban wetlands by a Marxist government in 1979 on the grounds that it was a tiger reserve, had been since the early 1970s. So against that kind of what's aimed to be called fortress conservation, most environmental organizations adopted participatory forms of conservation starting in the 90s. But, you know, I probably need to emphasize that the problems of recognition and of conservation refugees have not disappeared. The other set of problems that emerges in multi-species justice concerns are not so much the interests of human communities as pitted against the ones of certain non-human ones, as I've just described, but the interests of different non-human species. So what claims do different species have when they compete in our moral consideration? So, for example, when the elephant population in South Africa's major national park had swelled from 5 to 20,000 in 2008, park rangers suggested that some of them needed to be culled so as to preserve some of the plant vegetation that also sustains other animal species and ecosystems as a whole in the park. And others argued, by contrast, that nothing could justify the killing of animals, especially highly intelligent vertebrates and mammals, such as elephants, which were also being poached, of course, on a lot of the rest of Africa. But not killing them, of course, would entail the endangerment of plants, of ecosystems, and of other species that depend on them. So one example of where you sort of have to consider the demands of different non-human species. Now, these problems arise in the examples that I've mentioned when we're concerned with the conservation of wild animals and wild or protected ecosystems. And, you know, I realize there's all kinds of problems with the term wild. I'm just using it as a shorthand here. They pose themselves, though, in a different and no less urgent way when we think about urban animals, and it's on the urban context that I'd like to focus. Urbanization, as I'm sure you know, is one of the most salient characteristics of what's come to be called the Anthropocene. Already more than half of the global human population lives in cities today, and that's projected to go up to 70% by the middle of the century. So some urban ecologists and activists argue that the city is humans' major habitat for the future, and that they're also the places where most people have the most contact with nature. The geographer Jennifer Walsh, in that context, has proposed the term zoopolis for thinking about humans and other animals in the city. So she's talked about this in a lot of her publications. I've just put one quotation here on the slide where she says, we have just begun to think about the moral choices we make in building and living in cities and what they mean for animals. If animals are granted subjectivity, agency, and maybe even culture, how do we determine their survival in the city? If urban and environmental justice is eventually brought in to include animal justice as well, questions also arise about how radical in urban democracy we can visualize our handle and practice. So these questions of capabilities and participation really arise. Scientists and urban planners have begun to think about these issues, starting In the 90s, the fields of architecture, urban planning, landscape architecture, and design have generated a profusion of theoretical paradigms and practical applications under labels like green urbanism, landscape urbanism, urban political ecology, biophilic design, and others. I've put a bunch of those on this slide. And these approaches have all sought to draw attention to the many forms of urban nature, sometimes by relying on community science, and to foster the creation of more and more equitably distributed nature for cities. So, river and lake cleanups, park creation, urban farming, green roofs, wildlife corridors, and ecological restoration, to name a few. Now, these approaches are incredibly wide-ranging, and some of them are incompatible with each other in their underlying theories and their practices. But I do think it's fair to say that they share two basic arguments. One, that the city is habitat for more and far more diverse life forms than we usually assume. And two, that access to green spaces and biodiversity is in many places insufficient and unevenly distributed. So that architects and planners need to integrate that equitable access into their work. So you could broadly say that we've gone from thinking about nature in cities, the parks and the rivers and the lakes, to nature for the city, the question of how we can increase the total number and equitable access to green and blue spaces and to other species. And from there, we've gone to the city as nature, a more fundamental rethinking of urban environments as ecosystems of their own. Different from other ecosystems with, distinct properties like the heat island effect, distinctive types of fauna and flora and different water regimes. And that will be an approach that casts the city as a novel ecosystem. This is a term that comes from the Australian ecologist Richard Hobbs and his collaborators. What they meant originally by that term is ecosystems that have been altered by humans, but then abandoned and left to their own development again. So, think of abandoned mines or logged forests, for example. And clearly that is not what cities are. Cities are constantly being intervened by and maintained by humans. But still, the term was adopted very quickly by some of Hobbes's own collaborators as a way of driving home the point that cities are ecosystems that we don't as yet understand very well. So in that framework of shifting knowledge and perceptions about nature and non-human life in cities, I've been researching recurring stories about particularly animals, also to a lesser extent plants in cities, narrative patterns that repeat themselves, not just in fiction and in feature films, but also and above all in journalism, in web and TV news, and in photography and documentary film and photography. So it tries to reach sort of across the boundaries of what is usually conceived to be the purview of literary studies. My working hypothesis is that these stories come with particular patterns of affect and to a certain extent shape what we think of as the community of justice in an urban context and what kind of justice would be most appropriate. So I just want to run by you some of the most important ones that I've found, just to give you an idea of what they look like. So the first one is the wasteland narrative. So the story that there is little biodiversity in cities, or that the biodiversity that is there doesn't count because it isn't native and it's similar all over the world. So, the hypothesis that cities contribute to global biological homogenization. That narrative is still embraced by a fair number of biologists and ecologists, I think, although I think it is on the way out. It typically entails that the only species that have a claim to justice in the city are native species, which deserve to be protected and enhanced, and non-native species, by contrast, don't deserve protection and are best reduced or even eliminated. The second story pattern is the discovery narrative, the discovery of certain species in dense urban environments that wasn't known to be there before, with the idea of surprise and sort of an attitude of not knowing how they fit into our urban community and community of justice. So, in my city of Los Angeles, an insect survey revealed hundreds of species 10 years ago that were not known to exist in LA, and included 38 species of flies that in fact had not been identified by science before. So that was a typical instance of this kind of story, which often has now recurred in other cities. The third one is the attack or invasion narrative, animals that aren't supposed to be there in cities, but that are here and that threaten either human kids or pets. So when you look at the news, you know, these urban coyote stories that attack or eat cats and small dogs, or mountain lions that attack joggers. You know, stories that often come sort of tinged with fear, quite often with metaphorical overtones that include other unwanted urbanites like homeless people or poor immigrants. And one particular subvariant of that narrative template is that of the invasive species, the species that doesn't belong, doesn't have any natural predators, and that wreaks havoc on native biodiversity. Some of you may know the British novelist China Miéville's monumental novel Perdido Street Station. That is a story of an invasive species, a species of soul-sucking giant black moths that invade the fictional city of New Crobuzon, which is itself inhabited by multiple sentient human, animal, plant, and mechanical species. The fourth narrative template is that of the miraculous survival or rescue. Often in TV news, you know, the little the visuals of say a duck with chicks crossing a major freeway, coyote cubs being rescued. These are justice stories. There's always a sense, or the conclusion is that innocent life was saved here, life that is worth preserving. So quite different from the attack or invasion narrative. The fifth one, to which I'll return later on, is the adaptation narrative, the discovery that some species make surprising uses of urban environments, the cleverness of raccoons in getting at human trash, or that of crows in using car traffic to crack nuts, for example. I'll come back to this story in particular. And the last one I wanted to just draw your attention to is the rewilding narrative, stories of animals recolonizing the city that they were mostly excluded from in the 19th century. For example, in news items about bears coming to take swims in suburban swimming pools, we get that quite a bit here in Los Angeles in the heat of summer, or also, you know, in literary context, in a story like the Swiss one from 1982, Die Rückeroberung, the Reconquest, by the writer Frank Hohler, that narrates wild animals taking back an unnamed city in a process that humans are unable to stop, in which the narrator anticipates will take place all over the globe. So in terms of justice, this is a typical comeuppance story for humans. This is in the narrator's view, often the just desert for their exclusion and their poor treatment of nature. So when you look at literary texts and at feature films, these templates, of course, often overlap or combine. It's also true of some more sophisticated kinds of journalism, of course, or they get twisted in complex and ambiguous ways. And when that happens, humans sometimes get displaced as the central urban citizens and agents, and we get a glimpse of cities from the animal point of view. So these are not necessarily stories that fit into the rewilding narrative template. Rather, the rewilding takes place at the level of form. So the animal perspective becomes dominant, and humans seem like the more extraneous, unimportant, or trivial urban elements. And I think these stories are particularly interesting in terms of the questions that they raise for multi-species justice thinking. So I wanted to zero in on a few of those and explain, how they're of interest. So one example is the French novelist Bernard Werber's Ant trilogy. So it came out in the 90s. And so I think only the first volume has been translated into English, but the titles are The Ants, The Day of the Ants, and The Revolution of the Ants. Half of the protagonists are humans and half are ants, and large parts of the novels engage with life in a mid-sized French city from an ant point of view. The basic plot pattern is that of a mystery. And to carry this out, Werber did in-depth research on the cognitive, perceptual, and social life of ants, and seeks to integrate this scientific perspective, this knowledge the scientific knowledge to represent the ant perspective. So one of the ants, for example, encounters completely dead ant burrows when it's in this case a he ant, on his explorations. The scene, as it's described, evokes a Holocaust for the human reader, but not for the ant, to whom the causes of mass deaths remain unexplained. The reader comes to understand gradually that these are burrows on which pesticides were used. So it's where the reader is prompted to sort of use the kind of justice thinking about the Holocaust for something so introducing that sort of perspective, that human perspective of justice, at the same time that we continue to follow the ant, who in fact does not understand why there's such a horrific spectacle unfolding in front of him. Communication between ants via haptics and pheromones are described in detail, and the humans eventually develop a technology through which that sign system can be translated back and forth with human language. And that becomes sort of a crucial plot element later in the first novel and in the following two. So at the level of content as well as style, the novels oscillate back and forth between estranging the city and human forms of communication from the reader and refamiliarizing them through human affects and perceptions. So this is one of the most radical attempts that I know of to represent an animal perspective in literature and to really rejig our perspective on the city so as to make it not a habitat of humans, but actually predominantly a habitat of a very different species. Urban animal perspectives and other media undertake different kinds of experiments. The British filmmaker David Attenborough, which I'm sure everybody is well familiar, has produced animal documentaries for 7 decades now that are often spectacular in content and innovative in film technique. But he's almost never trained his eye on cities. In 2016, though, he did in episode 6 of the series Planet Earth 2, which is an hour-long exploration of urban animals. Most of the stories he tells in that episode are, they follow the template of the adaptation story. So he focuses on animal species in large cities like, like Mumbai or New York that develop larger populations, so are more reproductively successful than their non-urban conspecifics. So, you know, that's an interesting fact biologically, but it's not one that's immediately interesting narratively or cinematically. It's just sort of a statistical fact, right? So Attenborough conveys the adaptation narrative through a visual sleight of hand. He shows animals that move through infrastructures built by and for humans in a completely inhuman way. For species that are used to navigate rocks, cliffs, and mountainsides, heavy stone and metal structures become launch pads for an aesthetics of anti-gravity, in which bodies leap, glide, fly, and fall in ways that seem to suspend the laws of physics and to relegate human bodies to a mere background. So I wanted to show you 2 examples of that. The first one is about peregrine falcons in New York.
New York City. This densely built-up landscape is as unnatural as anywhere on Earth. And yet, this wild peregrine falcon looks out onto an ideal habitat. Strange as it may seem, this vastly altered landscape replicates the conditions in which peregrines evolved. The towering buildings have a multitude of ledges on which falcons can nest, and the high perches that they need to catch the wind. New York City has the highest density of nesting peregrines anywhere on the planet. Winds striking the sides of the skyscrapers are deflected upwards and can help the birds gain height. And the great areas of concrete roasting in the sun create thermals, so that with very little effort, the birds can soar over the city. And so many peregrines can live here because down at street level there is a lot of potential prey.
And so he goes on to explain how the peregrines don't always catch their prey in the urban environment, in the building environment, but then catch them over the lakes and the rivers. So you see a little bit of the sort of visual aesthetic here, which might be unsurprising for birds, but this kind of aerial inhabitation of the city isn't limited to birds in his perspective. He also demonstrates it with langurs in Jodhpur, India. Let me show you another shorter clip of that.
Jodhpur, India. A gang of bachelor male langurs has come to challenge the resident alpha male. This alpha rules over a valuable urban territory. But maintaining dominance here is a constant struggle. The bachelors have united to try and overthrow him. If they win, one of the challengers will take over the alpha's troop of females and may kill his infants. There are 15 males in this bachelor group. The alpha must evict every single one of them from his territory. He has chased half the bachelors away. But a splinter group has looped back and is harassing his females. Once again, he has to battle. Finally, he manages to expel them all.
So the appearance of flight here, of course, is a lot more artificial than in the case of the falcons. It's generated through slow motion, which creates this surrealist vision of bodies moving through cities with inhuman flexibility and speed, using and defending human habitats as their own. Jodhpur and New York transform into scenarios viewed from above, in which pigeon prey and competitor monkeys are much more important than humans, who appear as small, irrelevant, and strangely immobile onlookers. You saw how in the Jodhpur sequence, there are just these three people that have a sort of surprised look on their face in one very quick scene. The reversal is spatial as well as ontological. Cities become habitats for flying rather than walking or driving, more than human cities, David Abrams might say. Justice is an implicit rather than explicit part of the argument, but it is very clear that non-human regimes of justice, of territoriality, assert themselves in the midst of human environments and make human regimes of justice almost irrelevant. But of course, this film still has Attenborough's authoritative voice to reassert human presence and mastery in the face of animal cities. other less spectacular, but I think more radical films do away with even that human presence. Mikael Kristersson's experimental Swedish film, Falkens Öja, the Kestrel's Eye from 1998, shows a pair of kestrels nesting in a church tower and raising 5 chicks. This film has no accompanying commentary at all. In fact, no human voices, except those the kestrels overhear occasionally from the church, the cemetery, or the nearby street. The camera focuses completely on the birds, their mating, hunting, and raising of the chicks. Intention, movement, and vitality are all uniquely associated with the kestrels, the male's ability to stand still in the air with beating wings, the extraordinary vision that allows them to identify a mouse or lizard from hundreds of feet above and to catch them in precipitous and precisely targeted downward swoops. The male and females bond with each other. Human activities, by contrast, are a mere background, and they appear strangely purposeless and mechanical. Joggers running past the cemetery, visitors who rake the gravel in the graveyard and water the flowers again and again. Weddings, funerals, a parade to honor the Swedish national holiday, all of these are shown from above, as the kestrels might see them. They're all sort of mildly interesting, a bit strange, hard to understand, and ultimately not of very much importance. So like in Valbert's and novels, the animal's experience of the urban environment leads to a defamiliarization of human infrastructures and structures of justice and social organization, human ideas about the good life, human ideas about what is just. Of course, now you could argue that it continues to be the human eye and human technology that construct these animals' perspectives for us. But the immediate result is nevertheless a seismic shift in the perception of urban environments. And there are also texts that actually precisely thematize that tension between the animal perspective and our awareness as readers or viewers that the animal perception is humanly construed. I don't have time to talk about this today, but we can come back to them in the Q&A. But I think sort of 3 impulses for multi-species justice thought emerge from texts such as Valbert's and films like Attenborough's and Kristersson's. One, that animal perception and agency repurpose even the most seemingly artificial objects and environments for what you might call natural projects, cities included, and that urban environments are habitats for more than humans, whether we intended or not. So they're unintentional zoopolises. 2, in drawing our awareness to this already existing zoopolis, they complement the efforts of urban ecologists, architects, and planners to understand the multi-species city and to actually reshape it and integrate it into planning, policy, and design. Thinking here of the work of somebody like Timothy Beatley, the ecologist who's deeply engaged with urban planning and seeks to reconstruct cities so that they are hospitable to non-human species. So he and other scientists and activists along those lines seek to construct better functioning zoopolises intentionally that benefit both humans and non-humans, taking the idea of novel ecosystems as an imperative to build a multi-species urban future. And 3, what underlies the imaginary as well as material construction processes is an attempt to build the natures of the future, many of which will be urban in one way or another with multi-species justice in mind. In other words, there is a utopian or at least optopian impulse that drives the zoopolitical imagination in all of these cases. Now, let me bring this down to the level of practical policy and conflict, though, a little bit more, and show some of the problems that arise. And I wanted to give you 2 examples from my hometown, Los Angeles. Couple of miles south of the western part of Los Angeles, where I live, are the Bayona wetlands, one of the few remaining coastal wetlands in California. A large part of these wetlands were converted into subdivisions in the course of the 20th century. And what you see in the background there is Marina del Rey, which is just south of Venice, where I live, which, the wetlands extended into that. That was already converted in the 1950s. The relatively small part that still exists has become a fierce battleground for different environmentalist visions between advocates for connecting the wetlands with the beaches from which they are currently separated by buildings, advocates for keeping the wetlands separate as they were before 1850, but digging up a great deal of the construction debris on which vegetation has grown for decades now and reducing non-native plants. And then there's activists who argue that any such large-scale intervention will kill or endanger a lot of the animal species that live there now, native and non-native. It's a very vibrant biodiversity. It's a bird watching hotspot, lots of lizards and small mammals and so forth. So the question of capabilities of flourishing for whom and for what reason? There are also questions as to how much the wetlands should be open for human enjoyment. Do we allow green space and biodiversity deprived Angelenos access, along with their dogs, who are often off the leash in spite of instructions to the contrary? Or do we keep people and dogs out to give rare ground breeding birds a chance? And into all of this comes, in addition, the question of the homeless, groups of whom camp out in the wetlands illegally. As a colleague and I recently pointed out in an article we co-wrote, and I put the link at the bottom of the slide there, none of the current proposals for restoration include one that would say, well, wetlands and its species may be important, but homelessness is our major crisis right now, and we have to convert what's left of the Ballona wetlands to housing. Now, the reason that doesn't come up may have to do with the sheer magnitude of the homelessness crisis, the rarity of this particular ecosystem, or the concern for non-human species. But multi-species thinking obligates us, I think, to consider this option, because the fate of the unhoused and that of urban animals often runs parallel in these city contexts, even though there may be good reasons to say we want to reject the conversion of this ecosystem to housing in the end. Let me give you another example of the kinds of questions and problems that urban multi-species justice leads you to. My interest in how native species, non-native species, and humans co-inhabit the city led me to a film project that the Lab for Environmental Narrative Strategies at UCLA produced in 2018 in collaboration with the public television station KCET. It's a short 10-minute documentary called Urban Arc Los Angeles, and deals with the kind of parrot, red-crowned Amazons, that are common in Pasadena and the San Gabriel Valley of East Los Angeles. So these parrots are the descendants of escaped pet parrots that were poached in northeastern Mexico by the tens of thousands in the 70s and 80s and taken to the US for sale. They're now endangered in their original habitat in Tamaulipas and Leon, with a remaining population of under 10,000, possibly even below 5,000. It's very hard to come by precise numbers. The population in LA is 2,000 to 3,000 strong and thriving, so it's an important portion of what remains of an endangered species. So in this case, an introduced and now endangered species has found sanctuary in a major metropolis without humans planning for it or managing it. Examples like this one have led a biologist colleague at UCLA, Bradley Schaefer, to argue that what in this case has happened spontaneously could become an opportunity for planned urban conservation.
We create all these different habitats in urban centers. We create vertical walled cliffs. We create all these different habitats in urban centers. We create vertical walled cliffs. We happen to call them office buildings. We create vast expanses of rock outcrops. We call them sidewalks. Those are habitats that wouldn't naturally be here, but we've created them. So then the question is, what goes into these created habitats that are unnatural for this part of the state, but where a lot of different species could make it there? And the way it normally works is it's just luck. Somebody lets something go, something shows up, and we have suddenly a bunch of non-native individuals living in that habitat. I think we can do better than that. And I think we should do better than that. And we should, in fact, manage which species show up in our non-native habitats. And we should pick ones that we want to have here.
While Schaefer and I continue to believe that it makes sense to protect and foster and reintroduce native species when and where it's appropriate, we also think that the city offers many new ecological niches that we might use for conservation of species that are not native. What should occupy these niches is in part a biological discussion, but also and above all, a cultural one. What species do different communities want to see around, which ones not, and why? How do ideas about justice in reversing extinction come into these decisions? What future city do we envision that we'd like to work toward? How do we involve as many voices and perspectives as possible in these discussions? That is, I think, what a focus on urban multi-species justice can deliver as we work towards zoopolis. Not easy answers, obviously, to complex decisions about urban animals, but a shift of that decision-making from biological to cultural grounds. Using the artificiality of urban habitats as a conservation opportunity is, of course, still a really contested notion. Some biologists and environmentalists are wary of intentionally introducing species into habitats where they are not native. And what they fear, of course, is that they might become native and then harm others, that they might become invasive, and harm other species. But the native, non-native distinction itself doesn't really have that much traction in an environment like LA that already includes species from many different ecosystems around the globe, and that is fundamentally artificial at this point. So I've tried to outline here how narratives about animals and more generally biodiversity in cities have been completely transformed over the last 30 years with important consequences for multi-species justice. Narratives of loss and absence continue to circulate that focus on the species displaced by urban structures and those that are put at risk in them, and those are clearly important. But other narratives have also emerged that revolve around the presence of biodiversity, around greening, restoration, zoopolis, biopolis, and conservation. These stories paint a very different picture of multi-species cohabitation and multi-species justice in the city, and one that opens up, I think, new possibilities in the general panorama of extinction. Thank you.
Okay, I believe Kelly is going to be fielding the questions.
Yes, as the in-person representative, I will do that. So if anyone here in the room or on Zoom has a question or a comment, please let either Vass or myself know. I see Tracy's hand, and then we'll go over to Margaret.
Yeah, I just toward the, that was a great talk, by the way. I really enjoyed that. Thank you so much. I have pages and pages of notes, lots of things to read. So at the very end, when Schaefer talks about picking the ones you want in your urban environment, I had a kind of reaction to that in the sense that it makes sense to me if a species comes and thrives and is able to build homes in that space, that makes sense. But what happens to the ones you don't want there that are there? And the issue of picking became, or choosing, kind of struck me as maybe problematic.
Yeah, I think it is, and it is intensely so. And that was, one of the objections that we got to the film was that, I mean, there was a general objection that just, okay, so if Ursula and Brad want to introduce a non-native species, at least we'll know whom to sue if they go invasive, right? I mean, this is a very litigious environment. I mean, what he's talking about, and what he's written a short piece about this too. So the idea is, you look at, say, the UCLA Botanical Garden, and there's a little waterway in there that is intensely populated by red-eared slider turtles, which is also an escaped pet species and one that exists all over the world. I mean, it's in East Asia, it's in Europe, it's in New York, it's here. These are popular turtles in the pet trade that people get bored with and let go, and that propagate very successfully in many urban environments. So biologists try to also introduce Western pond turtles, which is an endangered California species. They have not liked it there. The UCLA Botanical Garden doesn't work. So one of the ideas that Schaefer proposed was, okay, but there are also Eastern spotted turtles that are endangered along the whole eastern seaboard of the United States. They might actually have a much better chance to survive in the urban environment. So in the interest of doing something about extinction, wouldn't it be worth trying to see if spotted turtles can thrive in the UCLA Botanical Garden? instead of, or in addition to the red-eared slider turtles, which are totally not endangered. In fact, a lot of countries and cities find that they have too many of them and that they actually do displace other species. So these are the complicated questions. And I mean, you're totally right. The question then is, on what grounds do you make those determinations? And when you talk to scientists, they'll usually just use ecological reasoning, like what can possibly survive here, what is endangered. I mean, another example that he uses is, Southern California has pretty good gecko habitat, but there aren't any native gecko species. And biologists think that sooner or later, there will be some geckos here, escaped geckos, geckos that people let go, geckos that are not native. I mean, there are no native geckos here. So their idea is, okay, well, why couldn't we deliberately introduce endangered Madagascar geckos, for example, and create sort of a sanctuary for them? So that's the basic underlying thinking. I think what to me is problematic is that the question is, who makes that decision? So that's where participatory justice really, really comes in strongly. When people suggest, as part of the rehabilitation of the LA River, to reintroduce frogs, turtles, and snakes, that's great, except the snakes are all going to get killed in no time at all, because along the LA River, that's space that we want people to use for recreation, and people do not want snakes close to where their kids play, no matter whether they're venomous snakes or not, or even if they're completely harmless. That's just not what people want. So you don't, so in other words, you can't do this without consulting the communities that actually live there, not to make their desires, which are often also quite irrational and based on what I think many of us consider to be wrong conceptions of certain types of animals. So you don't want to make those axiomatic, but you certainly have to consult with the community. And ultimately, yes, these are cultural. Even the ecological reasoning in the end is, of course, cultural. It's about what we wish to preserve. It's about biopolitics, right, in the Foucauldian sense. And so I think it helps to be clear about this, but rather than just saying biopolitics, I think thinking about it in terms of justice and in terms of justice scenarios really helps to foreground what the different calls on our moral consideration are. But I totally agree with you, Tracy. I mean, the hard thing is that you're never going to be able to do right by everyone in the community of justice, right? That there will always be species that will suffer and others that will suffer, whose suffering will be alleviated. That is that's the really tough part about it. Does that sort of even begin to answer what you talked about?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, and I know that it's a question that's incredibly difficult. I can't answer it. It's something that plagues me all the time. And I mean, it comes to the issue that I have, such a problem with is culling. How do we feel about that? And I think often of the New Zealand case with possums and the extremes that took on, where you had children dressing dead possums in having little fashion shows and stuff, and prizes for the best costume on a dead possum. And so the whole notion of culling, although, like you said, if you've got one type of species that's invasive, it's killing other species, what do we do with it? And there have been attempts to use birth control in some species. And how do we feel about that? What do we say about that? And I don't know the answer. I really appreciate your answer. And I think that, yes, this sort of idea of participatory justice, how do we get as many voices to be heard in fair ways? But there's no easy answer, of course.
There is no easy answer. And I mean, look, there's been a longstanding battle here also about feral cats. So LA County has anywhere between 500,000 and 1 million feral cats that, to the best of our knowledge, the studies that have been done do wreak havoc on songbirds. So last year, the city council did pass a no-kill ordinance for cats. So people will be continuing to be allowed to feed them, and they're not supposed to be euthanized. They can be trapped, neutered, and released, which might solve the problem in 20 years, but probably never will. But there's not a no-kill policy for songbirds, right? That's the implication of that. You have a no-kill policy for cats, which means that then a lot more songbirds are going to get killed and a lot more lizards. So these so I think the hard part of it is that you can't avoid killing something. that is the sort of, I think, really difficult part, and the really sort of the part that I think makes that the sort of runs against our justice intuitions. Well, on the other hand, letting everything live also entails death, right? And I think that's sort of where it's so tough.
Yeah, just quickly, because I don't want to hog the time, and I'll talk quickly and then stop, because I know other people have questions. With the cat issue, I mean, that one to me is incredibly frustrating, because it's not about the cats, right? Domestic cats have no natural habitat. So what I've had this argument with people when they're like, yeah, well, they should go outside. And I'm like, that's not their habitat. Cars are not natural predators, right? So the onus is on humans to keep those, to build environments for those cats that contain them, but still simulate them, right? And then you shouldn't have the problem. I mean, you will have the problem, obviously, right? But the onus on that one is on people.
No, well, it is, but now it isn't anymore. I mean, a lot of the feral cats here were born in this. I mean, they were not born in an apartment or in a breeding facility. They were just born in a backyard, in an alley, somewhere. So in fact, they do have a habitat now, and it's LA.
Yeah.
So that's the problem, right? So once you have that population that propagates on its own, I mean, there are big feeding debates and such, but it is a population that is pretty self-sustaining. So then the question is, how do we look at that? How do we think about that? And I find that one very difficult. The city of LA has now decided it in a certain way, but I think in a way that I think appealed to the very strong cat lobby that we have in the city. But I think it left other issues really unjust, in my view, that are really tricky. But I mean, I totally agree with you that people need to keep their cats inside, but a lot of people don't, just like people in the Bayona wetlands, even though signs everywhere, keep your dogs on leashes. When I go running there, almost all the dogs are off leash, now and then there's one that's actually on a leash, so people, that is on humans, but what do you do about that?
Hi, this has been wonderful. I'm Margaret, and I'm intrigued by what I saw in your presentation around the interdisciplinarity that you're bringing to critical animal studies. So I'm wondering if you could say some more about how you engage students in concepts of environmental justice within the discipline of English in terms of form, content, and affect.
So one of my favorite classes that I teach every spring quarter is a class called Environment and Cultures. It was originally, the registrars has it as literature and the environment. I always call it environment and cultures, where the basic emphasis, the take home for the students for the entire class, it's the basic learning goal, is to understand that environmental issues that are considered the same everywhere. From the point of view of science, things like deforestation, soil contamination, biodiversity loss, toxicity, so on, climate change, actually are very, very different issues against the background of different historical memories, in the context of different languages, different social structures, and different cultural practices. And that's where I teach environmental justice. With a particular emphasis on Indigenous perspectives, just because there's so much great material about this. Many of you might know Robin Wall-Kimmerer's Braiding Sweetgrass, which is a wonderful book about the convergences and conflicts between Indigenous knowledge and botany, a knowledge about plants. And she's both a trained scientist and a Native American. So you get both perspectives in one book, or something like Kapiranga-Juk Inuit Knowledge and Climate Change, which is about Inuit populations and their view of climate change and what's happening in their environments. So that is where environmental justice comes in, and where I then try to bring in, or where I teach multi-species justice. So what if we extend the community of justice to the non-humans? How does that change how we look at the already considerable problems of human justice between human communities? How does it change how we line this up? And typically, I try to sort of present them with different narratives about how these two conflict or converge. So, one common saying among environmental justice advocates is, oh, what's good for the land is good for the people. So saying that, the more than human justice is equivalent to justice, especially for disadvantaged communities. And that is perfectly true when you talk about scenarios of toxicity, of deforestation, but yeah, pollution toxicity in particular. I mean, you clean that up, that is really good for humans and non-humans alike. So I teach toxicity stories and how they affect, humans and animals. But then I teach conservation stories, and the two sometimes conflict. So there's a wonderful graphic novel called Virunga that is about, gorilla conservation in the Virunga National Park in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, that talks about the civil war that took place there, and the refugees and the UN forces and the park rangers and the different militia groups that are all in the park and whose interests all, sort of diverge and conflict around gorilla and old growth forest conservation. So that's where I sort of try to say, okay, so what do we do when they don't line up? Because when they line up, that's urgent to do, and it's important to emphasize. But in some sense, conceptually, that's the easy part. To me, the more difficult and interesting part is when they conflict. And it's one of my greatest pleasures, I have to say, to see the students struggle with that and come up with very different answers to how you might solve that. How do you decide between, immigrants in a refugee camp in the Virunga National Park and gorilla conservation? Who gets vaccinated? Who doesn't? That kind of thing, right? Does that begin to answer what you're talking about? So it's actually, I think it's very easy to teach. I mean, I think a lot of students, know and love animals. What they're not aware of is, the implicit decisions we make about animals when we make decisions that seem unrelated to them, about habitat, about city construction, about building parks for people, or building recreation for people, or building housing for people. What we do and don't do, what the implications are. So that's what I'm trying to open their eyes up to, and give them some basic tools of how we might think about it. If not solutions, those are often harder to come by.
Thank you very much.
This is Kelly again. So we have two questions in the room from Melissa and Jess. So we'll take those. And then we have a question in the chat from Meg, and then Tony in the room. So I'll do 2 and 2, if that's okay with you, Ursula.
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks. Hello, I'm Melissa over here. I did some of my research for one of my classes doing my master's was about the coyotes in Stanley Park last summer. I don't know if you're familiar at all, but it was like a whole media storm. And I just wanted to read out to everyone one of the headlines that came up that kind of is exactly what Ursula's talking about, but it was coyotes who ingested illegal drugs could be behind a rise in vicious attacks at Stanley Park, expert says. So basically there's a lot of homeless bashing. It's like, oh my God, the coyotes are on crack because there's homeless people in Stanley Park. And Stanley Park has this really long history of a lot of litter and garbage was blamed on the gay community, the queer community, but especially gay men there. And I also have a background in film studies and cultural studies. So I actually really appreciated Margaret's question too. So I was going to ask you, Ursula, because we were talking about forms and aesthetics and how that creates that flip of perspective, and what you think the room or role of humor and comedy might be in terms of narratives. And thank you so much for your talk.
Those are great questions. Yeah, so actually at LENS, the Lab for Environmental Narrative Strategy, so we've been doing a podcast for the last couple of years, and 2 of the episodes are about urban coyotes and precisely about about that. And one of my students actually works on, he's in the environment and sustainability PhD programs, actually works on these intersections and overlaps between the treatment of unhoused people and coyotes. And the rhetoric is in different parts of Los Angeles. There are clear overlaps between wanting to keep coyotes out, wanting to keep homeless people out, and then in some variants also wanting to keep immigrants out in the more sort of xenophobic instantiations of that. So, and we're currently working on an animated series of videos. And the third one is the perspective of a coyote in LA. And it is who falls in love with a domestic dog who belongs to a homeless woman. And so we're precisely sort of wanting to investigate these issues of stories about who belongs and who doesn't belong in the urban context. Whom do we perceive to be native or having a right, if you want to phrase it legally, to the urban habitat and to particular parts of the urban habitat, and how do different kinds of rhetoric sort of overlap between those. I just alluded to that very, very briefly here because it's a whole book and is the subject now of various studies that are being done. So I think you're absolutely right that these two discourses overlap and that they are often used concurrently. And there's a fictionalization of that in T.C. Boyle's novel Tortilla Curtain, right? Which is not a great novel in many ways and has been criticized, I think, justifiably on a lot of grounds. But one of the things that it does get right is when it deals with a gated community, one of the groundskeepers, I think, at one point raises the question, well, is it actually coyotes that we're keeping out here, or is it immigrants? You know, because this is in a sort of Southern California sort of illegal immigration area. And he raises exactly the question of how these rhetorics sort of, substitute for each other and get metaphorically layered on each other. And then there are counter discourses. I mean, like Native American artists who've used the coyote and its sort of secretive uses of urban habitat as a metaphor for sort of political subversion and political resistance. So urban coyotes, I think, have become a real rhetorical nexus for all kinds of storytelling about who belongs into the city, who does not, who decides that, and what ideas of justice underlie these ideas. The second part of your question, I'm really, really interested in the question of humor and comedy, which is something that I think is a very, very powerful, potentially very, very powerful instrument. That was something that I actually really deeply engaged with in writing this book on extinction, because reading so many books and seeing so many films and photographs that revolved around extinction was a deeply depressing experience. I mean, spending 4 or 5 years of your life, just with stories about death, in some cases suffering, but just disappearance, loss, melancholy, mourning, was very, very depressing. And so I thought that that particularly in the context of extinction and endangerment, having somebody like Douglas Adams actually taking a comedic approach to it was really refreshing, and it did not diminish the power of the mourning and the melancholy, and it in no way diminished the power of the political appeal to do something about conservation. But it just was, it was his rhetorical strategy in Last Chance to See is to not to argue that animals are perfectly well adapted, but to emphasize how it's miraculous with so many endangered species that they have survived to this day, given how completely irrational and nonsensical their habits are, with then always a strategically placed comparison to how completely irrational and nonsensical humans are. And what a surprise it is that we're still around. So he compares, for example, the egg-laying habits of a particular bird species in Indonesia, where, instead of just laying eggs and sitting on them, that bird doesn't want to sit on its eggs, as Adams tells the story. And so it digs a big hole, which is an enormous amount of work, then lays the eggs, then puts an enormous amount of rotting vegetation on top, which is another huge amount of work. And then for the next 6 weeks, sort of goes monitoring the exact temperature of that incubation pile by adding and subtracting little bits of vegetation. And so Adam says, well, this bird is just like me. I love to spend a whole day designing a computer program to do something that I could have done by hand in 30 seconds, right? So he always very systematically places these comparisons. So the humor here comes from the non-adaptedness, that we're all sort of non-adapted, totally out of sorts, doing things that doesn't make sense, that endangers us, endangers others. But that's also what makes us lovable, and what makes these other critters lovable and worth preserving. So it is in some sense a human similarity argument, but a very idiosyncratic and funny one. I haven't quite seen that applied to urban coyotes in that same way. But I think it would definitely be a possibility, and we're to some extent trying to be humorous and a little bit funny in the animated video that we're doing.
Thank you so much. This is just completely fascinating. I really appreciate the framework you laid out in the Ballona wetlands example, with all of these kind of different agents or perspectives that we're supposed to be kind of toggling between in making these decisions. But one of the things that I wondered about is if you turned any attention to the time horizons in terms of, I'm thinking about a very much unresolved set of debates in legal and political theory about justice for future generations. And when you're describing that wetlands example, I just pictured this situation of just multiple futurities, and what does it look like to make a decision where you're taking into account future entities when you're at a decision point that's actually deciding who's going to come into existence and who's not. And so anyways, I was just wondering if you thought at all about kind of, we're looking at all of these different interested parties, all of which are future looking, but how far into the future are you thinking in terms of the model that you're developing? Thank you so much.
Yeah, this is a great question. And I don't think that I have a general model. I think it really, really depends on the specificities of the case. So and the Ballona wetlands is super interesting in terms of both futurity and the past, right? So, the Park Service wants to reconnect the wetlands to the coast, so as to ensure better water flows and, improve the general functioning of the ecosystem in that way, and wants to do major construction debris removal. And it looks like that's where we're going to go, and sort of take some of the creek out of the Ballona Creek out of its sort of concrete enclosure, and give it a sort of more natural course again. There are other urban ecologists, among them the director of the Audubon Society, Travis Longcore, who's a very accomplished urban ecologist, who says, well, actually, no, originally, it's circa around 1850 and before, actually, these wetlands were not connected to the ocean. There were big dunes there that separated them, and that was their distinctiveness as an ecosystem. And right now, the little beach city of Playa del Rey fulfills that same ecological function. It separates the wetlands. It's not dunes, it's buildings, but it actually, that is exactly how it should stay. And then he proposes other kinds of remediation within that. So they go back to different. One of them is sort of going back to what wetlands used to be 150 years ago. The other one says, no, that's irrelevant. No, that kind of wetland is gone. Let's make it what it was before the construction of Playa del Rey, when it was connected. So what point in the past you go back to, of course, is always a great, is a point about restoration. And then the question of present and future comes in terms of what species we want there to be in the future. So two of these factions, both the Park Service and the Longcore faction, sort of mostly native species of plants and animals there. So that is sort of their long-term future, is to make it something like what was here before, or what can still survive within, it being surrounded by a city. Whereas the Friends of the Ballona wetlands is an oddly present-oriented organization that says, but no, right now this is a very vibrant ecosystem, and I can confirm this. I mean, I go there all the time since it's not that far from where I am right now. It's about 3 miles south of here. So I go bird watching, I go running there. There is tons of animal life there, and of course also a lot of plant life, much of it non-native, but some of it native. There's a ton of animal life there, and what the Friends of the Ballona wetlands say is, look, anytime you bring in the bulldozers and the backhoes to remove hundreds of thousands of tons of construction debris, you're going to be killing much of what is there now. And Travis Longcore, who's a pretty doer kind of guy, at least admits that. He says, yeah, we are, that's true, but then it's going to recover, right? And they're saying, no, this is a very vibrant ecosystem. The non-natives have just as much of a right to be here as the non-natives. So why would we, so let's do some hand weeding and such, fine, let's do a little bit of remediation, but by human hands, let's not bring, or maybe a pick hoe or something like that, but let's not bring in bulldozers, for God's sakes, So they're very much about, okay, this is the present now, this is what we have, it is a vibrant ecosystem. And what was here 150 years ago is really not that important for the future, right? So the visions of the future are related to how important you think what was there in the past is. So that's, and that's the question of future generations precisely comes up in these arguments all the time. Is it like, are we killing some of the animals that are there now, or, destroying their habitat, displacing them so that future generations can flourish? Or do we say, no, our commitment is to what is there now, and we're only gonna minimally interfere? Does that make sense? And I think there is no general model for this, I think this is, and this is another one of these really, really thorny, it's kind of like the cats and the songbirds, I'm more on the side of the Friends of the Ballona wetlands in this case, because I think, look, this is a vibrant community. I don't really care what was there 150 years ago. I don't know why that's so important in a context like this one. This is where context is so important. I mean, this is surrounded on all sides by subdivisions, right? Quite pretty ones, quite pleasant to live in ones, So, no matter what we do, it's not going to be what it was in 1850 when LA practically did not exist. I mean, did not exist in its current form, and certainly nothing existed there. That's a sort of 20th century, second half of 20th century developments down there. So to me, it makes much more sense to say, no, let's cherish this for what is there now. And yes, okay, let's try to plant some more native plants to make it more butterfly habitat. There's a ton of ice plant coverage there now. And the ice plants, they're okay, they're ground cover, but they're not ecologically super functional, So yeah, let's maybe rip those out and use some of that ground to plant native plants that are useful for other animals. But let's leave the fennel in there. The fennel is a vile invasive in the eye of ecologists. It's also the favorite plant of Anna's swallowtails, So I've actually, should I admit this on a recording? I've actually planted fennel in my backyard because I love the Anna swallowtails coming. But yeah, it is a vile invasive weed, So let's, and that's, I do think that there is support for that from a lot of younger biologists. I mean, I've been very encouraged to hear some younger biologists come to UCLA and give talks about this. And they're actually not obsessed with native species anymore. They say, look, let's look at not at where things are from, but how they currently function. And that seems to me sort of, I mean, to the extent that I'm able to come up with any kind of general principle, that will be it. So if you have something that actually does harm a lot of other inhabitants of the ecosystem, as in my view, feral cats do, then I think that is a reason for saying that is a population that we need to reduce. But if it's something that's just there, like these red-crowned Amazons, it's not clear that they do any damage to anything that's there. They live mostly off of, in East Los Angeles, they live mostly off of the trees that people have planted, avocado trees, pecan nut trees. They love pecans. There are these Mexican trees that have sort of pods that they love to eat. I've seen them eat those, so they might be displacing some woodpeckers like starlings because they nest in trees. So there might be a little bit less space for woodpeckers, but nobody has shown that there is sort of a decline in woodpecker populations. So there I would say, well, why do we want to get rid of them? They have integrated fine into the urban ecosystem. So why would you, apart from the fact also that culturally speaking, of course, killing parrots would be really, really bad, right? That they tried that in San Francisco with the parrots of the cherry-headed conures, the parrots of Telegraph Hill, who had acquired cinematic reputation by then, and of course could not be eliminated. So I think that's as close as you can come. But I don't think it makes any sense to claim that in a totally artificial environment such as LA, you put a great deal of stake into what was there 150 years ago, what was native, to the extent that means anything anyway, since a lot of species were also introduced by Tongva Gabrielino peoples who were here before any Europeans were here, right? So that's how I think questions of time really come in. And in this particular context, the Ballena wetlands, where we're talking about totally urban, surrounded by artificial environments kind of ecosystem, I would say, the commitment to what's presently here outweighs, the fate of future generations that might or might not come after the restoration.
Thank you.
Sorry, very long-winded answer, but
I realize we're over time, so I'll just read Meg's question quickly.
Yeah, I actually saw Meg's question. Hi, Meg. It's great to see you here. I'll try to be brief. This is a very complicated question, I think, the question about human control. And I think, for me, one thing that multi-species justice thinking does is ask questions about it that are usually assumed to be unquestioned in scientific restoration efforts, right? And in the usual sort of policy. I think you're alluding to a very basic issue here in environmental thinking broadly understood, which is that on one hand, environmental thinking has questioned human control of nature and has, over centuries now, questioned the arrogance and the assumptions underlying the idea that humans can control nature. So that's one given. On the other hand, every single conservation or restoration effort, of course, assumes human control. Or human management at any rate. So to me, the most helpful person in that respect is the philosopher Elizabeth Anderson, who has written about this and has said, well, look, we don't typically allow other people to just randomly destroy ecosystems. So we don't need to allow rats or boars to do that either. We need to be sort of there needs to be a sort of thinking about weighing on one hand. It comes back a little bit to Tracy's question too, right? On one hand saying, yes, we need to think carefully about what the assumptions are that go into our management and control. But we can't just retreat from control and say, we're just going to let things happen, because that too is a form of agency and has often proved to be actually really, really bad for other species and for ecosystems. So I think there needs to be, just a close look of what kind of control we're exerting. But yeah, Elizabeth Anderson, I think, is really intelligent on that question and really nuanced. So I find her helpful.
Great, thank you so much. And Tony has one quick question to end.
I'll try and make it quick. Fabulous talk. One thing that was coming to my mind was a landscape architect who specializes in restoration ecology, works in cities, and a good friend. And one of the banes of his existence is squirrels. And in my city, there are about 20 times the density of squirrels that would exist in reasonably well-functioning ecosystem because of the, the constraints on predation. There's some predators, but nothing to control them. And so he's so frustrated by that. And he talks about the trophic subsidy that cities give to squirrels without the predation. So I was kind of thinking, where do cities begin and end? And one of the framework you give for thinking about these really difficult choices, I think is so far beyond the city. And that's, I think the one book that jumped out at me is a book by Chris Thomas, who's a really prominent conservation biologist. He wrote a book called Inheritors of the Earth, How Nature is Thriving in an Age of Extinction. And he was talking about some of the things you were mentioning about that, the getting away from the focus on just native species versus non-natives and making really, choices about species that can fill niches. But he does it in a way that I think lends to a certain euphoric sort of possibility. He talks about climate change as, accelerating evolution. And he's someone who's worked on extinctions from the conservation biology side of things, looked at the way species are moving in the context of warming temperatures, poleward, upward in elevation. And so he's done a lot of empirical evidence, has a lot of empirical evidence about how climate change is bearing on extinction risks. And then he comes to this point about how humans are increasingly shaping environments everywhere and need to be intervening and making choices about, enabling species to enter new ecosystems. And I think his discussion lends too easily slides into this euphoric sort of possibility about humans managing everything. And I think your framework for thinking about this is so much better, and it's such an antidote to the way his book ends. There's some really interesting stuff there, but I feel like what you're talking about is not, multi-species justice in the city, but it's so far beyond too. So I really thank you for that. It's not so much a question, but just a really great comment on a really great talk that I think where the city begins and ends. I think the stuff is so relevant beyond the bounds of the city.
Right. Thank you, Tony. That's of course lovely to hear. I'm glad that it's helpful. That's kind of what I'm struggling for, is just finding tools. And, these are really difficult questions. And you're quite right that Thompson is perhaps too optimistic. There's also another book by Fred Pierce, actually, that's also, I think, really interesting about how you can look at these so-called invasive species as actually the innovators, right? And that the changed ecosystems of the future what I appreciate about Thompson and Pierce and others is that they try to say, look, ecological change is happening at all scales. It's not necessarily always loss and always bad. And that's a basic question about extinction, too, that yes, on one hand, I think our instinctive reaction, if we care about animals and we care about nature and we care about conservation, is to experience this as loss and deprivation. On the other hand, and I tried to think about that in the Imagining Extinction book, of course, there is nothing that scientifically says that a global ecosystem and ecosystems with fewer species are better or are worse than ones with fewer. We have that right now. Desert and Arctic ecosystems have many fewer species than tropical ones. Doesn't mean that they're better or worse. They're just different, right? And 250 million years ago, when we had Pangea, the one supercontinent, biodiversity was a fraction of what it is today, because evolution thrives on geographical separation. So I think that argument goes even beyond that. But I think you're right. We also have to be careful about, I think you have to think very carefully about I like the term euphoric, because I do sort of still believe in utopia or optopia as working towards something better, as a really, really important and in fact foundational cognitive and political activity, and as sort of an obligation almost. But you're right that we also need to be wary of the too euphoric visions of what ecological change brings. And this question that Meg brought up of what about unintended consequences, and this idea that we can control everything, when in fact we don't, when there are always unintended consequences, and trying to think about those and trying to say, okay, but how can we think as much about those as we're able to, which will never be the totality of it, I think is super important. But that's, you know, I mean, the part that I am interested in is sort of thinking about cities as novel ecosystems, and then also thinking about novel ecosystems more generally. You know, we're going to have a lot of novel ecosystems with climate change, you know, and so neither falling into this despair of saying, oh, this is all lost, this is all much worse than what we had in the past. At the same time that we always think about what does it mean for the non-humans? You know, what do they lose? It's not about, it shouldn't be about what we lose, you know, in the end, I don't care about, I mean, I care emotionally deeply, of course, but rationally, I think it shouldn't be about what we care about, but about what does it look like from the perspective of the non-humans? And that's where I think, you know, animal studies is just so crucial at this moment, you know, and critical plant studies too, honestly, you know. So what does it look like from the point of view of the trees? You know, what do they lose or gain? And that, I think, could then temper some of that euphoria that you were rightly critical of.
So unfortunately, we are out of time, but thank you so much, Ursula. You gave us
Thank you, guys.
a ton of ideas to think through. And even though you weren't part of the conference, so many of your comments responded to what other people had already talked about sadness and depression and violence in the cities and loss.
Yeah.
And even though you are not yourself a critical animal studies scholar, I think this kind of conversation of like one of the best experts in extinction helps us think through these questions in a more deep and nuanced way. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Voss. And yeah, I mean, if any of you want to email me, I'm as you've realized, you know, these are questions that I struggle with, and I welcome inputs and ideas.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.